1 million bees just turned a Knoxville highway ramp into a no-go zone. And while that sounds like the kind of headline that belongs on a slow news day, it actually sits in the middle of a much bigger story. Who controls the roads? Who controls the skies? Who controls the shipping lanes? And who pays when powerful systems get shaky? Good morning, and welcome back to Daily. Today's roundup moves from a very real bee emergency in Tennessee to the far more serious collision between U.S. power, Iranian negotiations, and congressional authority. We'll also look at the latest violence in Lebanon and Gaza, because the word ceasefire is doing a lot of work that reality clearly isn't. Then we'll get into America's expanding drone war in Somalia and a brutal heatwave across Europe that's shutting down schools, straining grids, and reminding everybody that infrastructure only looks solid until the weather proves otherwise. If you're getting value from this, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. First, the bees. On Friday, a truck carrying about 1 million of them crashed on an exit ramp off Interstate 40 in Knoxville, Tennessee, and for a little while the whole area had to be treated like a live hazard zone. No injuries were reported, which is the important part, but the truck was destroyed, the ramp shut down, and drivers were told to stay inside their vehicles unless they were wearing beekeeper gear. That last instruction is the kind of detail that makes local news great. It has the calm, practical tone of somebody who's seen enough to know that 1 million bees do not care about your schedule. By the end of the day, officials said the bees had been removed and the truck was cleared away, but by then the internet had already done what the internet does. Representative Tim Burchett leaned right into the obvious pun game, and even the Virginia Department of Transportation chimed in with memories of another bee crash years ago. And state agencies are swapping bee jokes. You know the story has escaped the ordinary news cycle. Still, beneath the humor is a useful reminder. Transportation infrastructure is not just pavement and signage. It is everything moving through it. Freight, fuel, food, livestock, and yes, sometimes a trailer full of insects. One bad turn on a ramp, one rough rollover, and a normal highway becomes a soft lockdown. That may sound small next to international headlines, but it's actually the same basic issue. When a system is fragile, one disruption can force everybody else to slow down. Whether that system is a Tennessee ramp or the Strait of Hormuz, the principle is the same. And on that note, the bee story almost works as a perfect warm-up for the bigger questions in today's news. Because while Tennessee dealt with a swarm, Washington and Tehran are still trying to avoid one of a very different kind. The latest updates out of the Iran talks are a mix of progress, contradiction, and political theater. The head of the UN nuclear agency says inspectors will visit Iranian enrichment sites, which is one of the key pieces of the interim framework the US says it reached with Tehran. At the same time, the two sides are still telling very different versions of what was actually agreed to. Washington is describing a strong arrangement with high-level inspections and a stable shipping lane through Hormuz. Tehran predictably is pushing back on the more dramatic American claims and saying the details are not nearly as broad as US officials are making them sound. That mismatch matters a lot, because when one side says full and complete agreement and the other side says not so fast, you are not looking at clarity. You are looking at the usual fog that surrounds diplomacy when everyone wants credit before anyone wants accountability. There's also the oil piece. The US has eased sanctions on Iranian oil at least temporarily, and the Strait of Hormuz is open for the moment. Tanker traffic has reportedly picked up, which makes sense if the market believes the war's pressure has eased. But that is not the same thing as a stable long-term settlement. It's just a pause with paperwork. The more interesting question is who gets to decide whether this pause turns into something durable, and that brings us to Congress. In a historic move, the Senate passed a concurrent war powers resolution aimed at ending the Iran hostilities. That matters because this is one of the rare times Congress has used its own authority under the War Powers Act to tell the president to stop an unauthorized conflict. The vote was close, 50-48, and it crossed party lines in an unusual way. A handful of Republicans voted yes, one Democrat voted no. That alone tells you the issue is bigger than the usual left-right script. The basic principle here is simple, even if Washington tries hard to make it sound technical. If the United States is going to enter hostilities, there should be a legal and constitutional basis for it. Not vibes, not messaging, not a press conference with dramatic promises and no clear exit. And that's where the America First instinct lines up with the libertarian one. Foreign wars are expensive, messy, and easy to start. They are far harder to unwind. If the administration wants to keep threats on the table while also claiming the conflict is over, fine, but it should not be allowed to treat Congress like a decorative accessory. The best part of all this is that the same week the diplomatic language got softer, the rhetoric from the White House got harder. Trump has been warning that if Iran doesn't behave, the bombs could come back. That's the sort of statement that sounds tough in a clip, but it also reminds everyone that this so-called framework is still operating under pressure, not trust. And the coverage reflects that split too. Some outlets report the negotiations like they're a near miracle. Others, especially the more openly activist foreign policy outlets, tend to frame every move as proof of some hidden master plan. The truth is usually less cinematic. It's a fragile agreement, a skeptical Congress, an uneasy market, and two governments telling the world to believe their version first. One more layer makes this even more important. The US has quietly spent enormous amounts of money and political capital trying to keep this region from exploding again, even while the public gets a truncated version of the story. That pattern is why the war powers vote matters beyond Iran. It's a reminder that the constitutional guardrails still matter, especially when the executive branch is tempted to act like commander-in-chief means everything everywhere all at once. Now to the part of the story that exposes how shaky the whole regional picture still is. Even with ceasefire language on the books, Israeli strikes have continued in southern Lebanon. Reports from the ground say at least 2 people were killed in a drone strike near Nabatea, and artillery fire followed nearby. That came amid broader negotiations and public claims that the fighting had quieted. But quiet is not the same as over. Families in southern Lebanon have been returning to damaged homes, only to find entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Israeli officials are still insisting that troops will remain in what they call a security zone, and that they'll keep freedom of action if they see threats. Lebanese officials naturally say sovereignty doesn't work that way. Hezbollah says the occupation must end, and the whole arrangement remains suspended between legal language and battlefield reality. Some of the reporting on this is sharply framed, especially in outlets like Dropsite and Al Jazeera, which emphasize occupation, civilian harm, and war crimes language. That framing is not random, it reflects a real point of view. But even if you strip away the rhetoric, the core fact remains: a ceasefire that keeps producing fresh strikes is not much of a ceasefire. Gaza is even worse. The death toll since the latest ceasefire has reportedly passed 1,000, which tells you everything you need to know about how loose that word has become in this conflict. There are also reports of continuing restrictions, targeted strikes, and international criticism that keeps rising while the violence stays stubbornly alive on the ground. At the same time, the political layer around all of this is just as unstable. Israel wants operational freedom. Iran wants leverage. Hezbollah wants Israeli withdrawal. The United States keeps trying to act as guarantor, while also trying not to own the consequences of what it guarantees. That is a difficult act to sell when everyone can see the damage with their own eyes. And from a plain-spoken American perspective, the lesson is pretty simple. When Washington gets pulled into every regional dispute as referee, enforcer, and financier, it usually ends up with the bill and none of the control. That is not statecraft. That is exposure. While the Middle East grabs most of the attention, the U.S. air war in Somalia keeps grinding ahead. AFRICOM says it has already launched at least 68 airstrikes in Somalia this year, putting the U.S. on pace to beat last year's total and possibly set another record. That's not a small number. It's a signal that the rules of engagement remain loose, the tempo remains high, and the public remains far less informed than it should be. This is where the official story and the broader reporting get very different. The military isn't sharing much about civilian harm, and local conditions are hard to verify because the government there is unstable. Journalists face pressure, and armed groups restrict access in the areas they control. That combination is perfect for a forever war. Lots of force, very little visibility. Trump loosened the strike rules after returning to office, and now the numbers are climbing. That's the sort of thing that rarely gets treated like a national debate, even though it absolutely should. If the US is going to carry out dozens of airstrikes in a country most Americans can't find on a map without help, then somebody ought to be forced to explain why, what the objective is, and when it ends. Instead, the public gets a stream of sanitized terms: counter-terror operations, precision strikes, ongoing missions. The language stays neat while the actual situation gets blurrier. And that pattern is exactly why war powers exist in the first place. The executive branch is always tempted to expand mission scope. The bureaucracy is always tempted to hide the cost. Congress is supposed to be the brake. When it fails to act, the default setting becomes permanent intervention. Finally, Europe is getting hammered by a heatwave that has already broken records across France, the UK, Spain, and beyond. France logged its hottest day on record since measurements began, while parts of the UK saw the hottest June day ever recorded. Power outages have hit tens of thousands of homes in France. Schools have closed. Trains have been canceled, and multiple countries are issuing rare red or orange alerts. Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of Eastern Europe are all dealing with their own versions of the same crisis. This is where the climate coverage gets very confident very fast, and sometimes the tone gets ahead of the practical realities. Yes, the heat is real. Yes, infrastructure is struggling. Yes, climate patterns are changing. But the immediate problem for ordinary people is not an abstract political slogan. It is whether the grid works, whether hospitals can cope, whether the rails hold up, and whether your home can keep you alive when temperatures spike. That's the part worth focusing on. Europe built a lot of its housing, transit, and energy systems for a different climate. Now those systems are being stress tested in public. And once again, the larger lesson is not complicated. Resilience matters more than messaging. If a power line goes down, if a rail network buckles, if a city wasn't built for heat, the ideology doesn't keep the lights on. So the day in one sentence, a bee crash in Tennessee gave us the lightest headline, but the deeper story is about systems under strain. The big takeaways are these. Iran negotiations are moving, but the messaging is still conflicted. Congress just made a real constitutional statement on war powers. Lebanon and Gaza remain dangerously unstable despite all the ceasefire talk. Somalia's air war is expanding with too little public scrutiny, and Europe's heatwave is another reminder that infrastructure built for one world can fail fast in another. If there's a common thread, it's this: when institutions blur the truth, stretch the rules, or pretend a problem is already handled, reality usually shows up and corrects them. Which story do you think deserves the most attention this week? The war powers vote, the Iran negotiations, or the ongoing regional fighting that keeps undercutting the ceasefire headlines? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want more news explained clearly without the usury spin, like this video, subscribe to Daily, and I'll see you in the next one.